You're listening to the weekly Parsha podcast, recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat Shemesh Israel, 5777, 2017. This week's Parsha is Parshas Vayigash. We have the resolution of the climax of the story of Yosef and his brothers. Yehuda, as we left him last week, and as this week's Parsha begins, Yehuda steps up to Yosef and says to him that I have guaranteed this boy, this Binyamin, who you would like to take as a slave, I guaranteed to his father that I would take him home, that I would bring him back. And so he steps up for his brother Binyamin. It leads to Yosef revealing himself, and all of the sons of Yakov being reunited, and all of the Jewish people, Yakov Avinu himself, Jacob, and all of his children, his 70 offspring, come down to Egypt and begin their sojourn in Egypt. Now, in the process of this statement of Yehuda stepping up, Vayigash, I love Yehuda coming forward and stepping up for Benjamin, taking a stand, so to speak, for the guarantee that he made. So the Midrash tells us something very interesting and very difficult to understand. Midrash says like this. This is in Parsha Tzadik Gimel, 93, section Zayin, number 7. Davar Acher, Vayigash, I love Yehuda. Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, B'shasha tafas Yosef HaTzadik es Binyamin. When Yosef HaTzadik tried to grab Benjamin, v'amar lahem la'echov, and he said to his brothers, Ha'isha asher nimtza gavia b'yado hu yali la'aved, that the one who has been found, the goblet in his hands, he shall be for me a slave. Amar la Yehuda said to him, Binyamin atafus v'shalom v'esav, you're going to take Binyamin, there's going to be peace in the house of my father. Miyad ka'as Yehuda. Immediately, Judah was angered. He stood up and he shouted in rage, V'shag b'kol gadol, and he roared with a loud voice. V'holach koilei arba me'as parsa, and his voice was so loud it traveled 400 parsa, which is a great distance. Ad sheshama Chushim ben Don, until Chushim, the son of Dan, who was back in Eretz Yisrael, back in the land of Israel, he heard what was going on. V'kofatz me'eretz Canaan, and he jumped, says the Midrash, from the land of Canaan. Uba etzel Yehuda, he came immediately to Yehuda. He was able to use the secret concept of kafitzas haderech. He was able to travel in a moment a very far distance. He came immediately to stand by the side of Judah. V'shagu shnehem, and they both roared like lions. Uviksha eretz Mitzrayim lehafech aleim, and the land of Egypt wanted to turn over upon them. And the Midrash goes on to give us a whole description of the events, and it says that both Yehuda and Dan were referred to in two different nevuas, in two different blessings which were given through the concept of prophecy, as a gur aryeh, as a lion cub. So both of them have this aspect of lions, and therefore both of them have this aspect of roaring, of creating this monstrous sound. Now, I don't want to get so far in to the Midrash itself, but what I do want to point out, which is extremely interesting, is what the Eitz Yosef says. In explaining this Midrash, he points out like this. He says, U'b'chushim ben Dan nichlal Sherya me'shevet hadani. Included in the concept of Chushim ben Dan, whenever we have ideas or people or stories in the Midrash which are fantastic, which are unusual, which are difficult to understand, so we need to understand the Midrash is giving us a paradigm, it's giving us a mashal, an analogy. It's helping it. It might be literally true, but it's also giving us a concept for us to understand, not just for that particular circumstance, but also other circumstances which are parallel and will have a similar nature to this particular circumstance. So he says that Chushim ben Dan, Chushim, who was the son of Dan, who, by the way, interestingly, was deaf, he wasn't able to hear. So it's very interesting that the Midrash says that he was able to hear, obviously it means in a spiritual way, he was able to hear that Yehuda was roaring, but Chushim ben Dan also represents somebody else, and that is his great-great-grandson, who is called Sherya, who's from the Shevet, who comes from the tribe of Dan. Asher Yislav la'asid in Moshiach ben Dovid. Says the Eitz Yosef that in the future time, so there's going to be Moshiach ben Dovid, the Messiah, the son of David, is going to come, the king, the final king of the Jewish people. And he's going to be accompanied by Sherya, who's involved in the process of Moshiach, who's involved in the coming of the Messiah. But Milchama, in this war, he's going to help him with the war, Kamavur B'Zoyar, and elsewhere as well. It's brought down in the Eitz Yosef explains also in the Nevuah, the bracha that Yakov, that Jacob gave to his sons when he gives the bracha to Dan. Included in that Nevuah is the offspring of Dan, which is Sherya, this individual who's going to be a great-great-grandson of Dan, who's going to be involved in the process of Moshiach, who's going to stand there alongside Moshiach ben Dovid. Important to understand, Moshiach ben Dovid also comes from King David, clearly, and also comes from Yehuda, from Judah, the one who's stepping up here. Yehuda is the great-great-grandfather of King David as well. So we see here that the Midrash is telling us that Yehuda stands side by side with an offspring of Dan, which is in this case Chushim, and in the future time, when Mashiach, when the Messiah arrives, Yehuda's offspring, which is Moshiach, who comes from him, is going to stand side by side with another important offspring of Dan, whose name is Sherya. Now I want to point out that there's another place where we find that Chushim ben Dan appears in a story, in a Midrash type story in our Chazal, our sages, and it's a Gemara in Sotan, Daf Yud Gimel, page 13, and it speaks about the fact that when Yaakov Avinu died, when Jacob passed away, they brought his body, they brought his bones to Israel, to the Maras Machpelah, to the cave of the Patriarchs, in order to bury him. And the Gemara tells us that when he and his entourage, all of his children, came to bury him there in Hebron, so Esav, his brother, Yaakov's brother Esav, stood up and said, I'm not going to let you guys bury him there. That's my plot. Yaakov already used his plot when he buried Leah. We are two brothers. We have equal rights. I want my plot. Don't you dare bury Yaakov there. So they said, what do you mean? You sold also this burial plot to Yaakov Avinu, to Jacob. Esav said, I don't know what you're talking about. They said, we have a document. But the document, unfortunately, was left back in Egypt, says the Gemara. So they had to send back Naphtali, who was light-footed, who would be able to run back there quickly, in order to bring back this document, in order to stop the standoff with Esav. The Gemara tells us something very interesting, that Chushim ben Dan, who was deaf, so he said, what's going on? He couldn't see what was happening. He wasn't able to understand what was going on. He didn't understand the conversation. He obviously knew something was going on, but he didn't know exactly what. And they explained to him that, maybe they used sign language, or maybe he was able to read lips. They explained to him that this is the circumstance. Esav was trying to stop Yaakov from being buried there. And Chushim ben Dan said, that's not possible. How could he do such a thing? And Chushim ben Dan got up. He killed Esav. Very interesting. You have to see the details there. He knocked out his eyes. His eyes fell onto Yaakov's bier, onto his coffin. You have to see the Gemara there. It's very interesting. Yaakov sits up. Even though he's dead, he sits up and he smiles. Check out the Gemara. It's very interesting. Of course, everything there, every single detail has some kind of deep meaning, has a deep significance, and there's an analogy here. I'm not going to go into every detail now, but what we do see is that somehow the aspect of Yaakov Avinu being buried, the story of Yaakov being buried, has a similar theme to what's going on here. And Chushim ben Dan, just like Chushim comes to accompany Yehuda in order to help him out, so to speak, but also, as Yosef explains, there's some parallel to the story of what's going to go on in the future of Moshiach ben Dovid, of the coming of the Messiah. So too over here as well. As Yaakov is being buried, which somehow parallels also, it seems, the idea of redemption, so Chushim ben Dan also gets up there. He also stands up and he gets involved and he moves things along. Now, I would love to try to explore and examine the idea of Chushim ben Dan, who he is. His name Chushim is very interesting also. Chushim means senses. He's somebody who he has a lack of ability when it comes to his senses, and yet at the same time, he's somebody who has a very deep spiritual sense. And he's someone who his offspring are going to be involved in the process of Mashiach, of Geula. He himself is involved in these different points of Geula, of redemption. He's a very interesting personality, but I'm not going to explore that at this time. But what I do want to understand, what I do want to explore right now, is that we see over here something very interesting. And that is that when we think of Geula, when we think of redemption, we think of a time when all is going to be well, when all is going to be transformed, when all of the idols are going to be destroyed, when everyone is going to know about Hashem, everyone is going to have an absolute revelation of godliness. All of the people in the entire world will have nevuah, will have prophecy as the Nevi'im, as they prophesize about the future time. So we think about Geula, we think about redemption as a time of perfecting, as a time of movement into a state of perfection. But see, the issue here is, the problem is, that the stories that we're describing, both in regards to Yosef HaTzadik, and in regards to Yaakov being buried, we're not talking about points of apparent Geula. We're talking actually about points of descent. We're talking about a loss of Yaakov, of Jacob. We're talking about a loss of that spiritual insight of a Jacob, the one who was the leader of the Jewish people at that time. When we talk about the story of Yosef even, yes, there's a reconciliation between the brothers. Yes, there's a beautiful thing that's going on. But we're also talking about a point where the Jewish people are heading down into Gullus. They're heading down into exile. And so this is a point in the Jewish people's history which is the opposite of Geula. If anything, this is the beginning of their exile, and this is the beginning of the loss of their freedom, loss of their spirituality. So what is the idea that the Yosef is telling us? That here, and really the Midrash is telling us, that when we have this point in time, which is the revelation that Yosef is about to do to his brothers, to say, here I am, I'm Yosef, we have this point in time, somehow it represents, it parallels, and there has to be the same thing going on as in Geula. When it comes to redemption, certain things occur. And what we see here in this Midrash is that when we have stages and points in redemption, there's also going to be a parallel situation that's going to occur at each point, at each stage. But here it's not a full Geula. If anything, it's the opposite. So how are we to understand this idea? How are we to understand what our sage, our Chazal, are teaching us here? So in order to answer all these questions, I want to share with you one more question, the answer of which will help us to understand what's been going on until now. We find that by Yosef HaTzadik, we know at the very beginning of the story, so he has two different dreams. He has a dream with the stars and the sun and the moon bowing down to him. And he also has a second dream, which is the sheaves of each of his brothers all bowing down to his sheaf. And what's interesting here is that he has two dreams that say the same thing. And when it comes to Paro's dreams, the beginning of last week's Parsha, we see that he also has two dreams. And those two dreams say the same thing. Different metaphor, different analogy, but they say the same thing. And what's interesting is that when Yosef interprets the dreams for Paro, he explains that the reason that it happened twice, the reason that Paro had these dreams twice, the same dream, two different dreams, is because it means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God is ready to act on these things, the information that he's giving over to Pharaoh, the 7 years of plenty, the 7 years of famine. It's something that God is planning to do immediately. That's the reason why he had the dreams twice. It's something which God is intending right now. It's going to happen right now. And so when we look back at the dreams of Yosef, we have to ask the question, because Yosef's dreams were dreams that had to do with the fact that he was going to be the leader. He had those sheaves. They were collecting sheaves. It represented something that's going to happen 22 years later, that the brothers are going to come to him, and really the whole world is going to bow down to him, as it were, because he's going to be the leader in regards to Kalkala, in regards to providing sustenance for his family, and really not just for the Jewish people, but for the entire land, the entire known world at the time. But what's interesting is that he had the dream twice, two different dreams that showed the same thing. And yet it's not something that occurred right away. It was something that was a 22-year process that we experienced together with Yosef as we read the Parshas over the last 3 weeks. But it's not something that happened right away. So how are we to understand the fact that Yosef had those dreams twice? The same dream speaking of the fact that he was the leader. He was going to be the leader of the Jewish people, in light of the fact that it's not going to happen for 22 years. And the understanding, I believe that the proper understanding of what's going on here, and you'll see that this applies perfectly to the questions that we asked at the beginning. The idea here is that while it's true in regards to Paro, that there was something that was about to happen and was going to take place immediately, and the fact that the dream was repeated represented that fact. In regards to Yosef, there was also something that was going to take effect immediately. And it wasn't the fact that there was going to be a rulership of Yosef which was going to be immediately apparent, but what would take place immediately, what started the ball rolling, so to speak, for the entire process, that happened immediately. The very dream itself was part of what would spark the process, which would ultimately lead to Yosef HaTzadik being the leader over his brothers, the leader over all of Mitzrayim, over Egypt, and really the conduit for sustenance for the entire known world. But it was a process. And because of the fact that it was a process, Geula, redemption, is a process. The fact that there's going to be some amazing thing that's going to happen for the Jewish people, it takes time. The Jewish people are meant to be the conduit, just like Yosef is a conduit for goodness to come into the world, for sustenance to come into the world. So too, the Jewish people themselves are that conduit. And when the nation of the Jewish people is in a state of tikkun, when it's in this proper state, so the Jewish people live in the land of Israel, and we act as the conduit for all goodness to come to us, and thereby to the entire world. Israel itself is the spiritual conduit, the place where all of goodness comes into the world, through Eretz Israel, through the land of Israel, on a physical level, on a spiritual level. And whatever happens to the Jewish people is a reflection of what's going on to the entire mankind. But that is what happens when we get to a state of redemption. That's what happens when the Jewish people are ketikuno. That's why Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, he at his time was the kingship of the Jewish people was in its proper state. So he was, as Chazal tells, our sages tell us, he was a ruler over the entire world at that time. If you think about the concept of Esther Hamalka, Queen Esther, she was also had that aspect. But the idea in all of these cases is that there's a process through which the Jewish people are to come to a state of geula, a state of redemption, or really a state of being tikunam in the proper way that the order of creation is meant to be, that the Shefa has to come through them into the world. But in order for that to happen, there are stages in that process. The Jewish people, in order to get Eretz Yisrael, as Hashem says to Abraham, as Hashem says to Avram, they need to descend into Egypt. They need to become slaves, strangers in a strange land. And then after a certain amount of time, after the process has been completed, they come out Berechush Gadol with great wealth, and they come to the land of Israel, and they come to a state of tikkun, they come to a state of geula. But part of that process is the Jewish people descending to Egypt. That is also a significant part. You can't have the redemption of the Jewish people without their descension to Egypt. You can't have the geula, the redemption, without the exile. It's something that you see very clearly in the story of Yosef. The result of him being sold, the result of his difficulties, the result of all of these things, going to jail, ending up there for so much time until he meets the particular individuals who will speak about him to Pharaoh so that he can interpret the dreams, etc., for him to become that leader. That was all necessary. All of those things, those stages, those stops along the way were necessary. And so it's considered as if he had those dreams. Hashem is memar lasoso. He had those dreams about the fact that he's going to be the leader. Immediately, nisgalgal hadvarim, the matters roll. It starts rolling. The process begins. And so each tachana, each station along the way of the process also has a quality of redemption. You see, you can't really separate the process from the result of the process. And so when our Chazal tell us, when our sages tell us that certain things take place when there's a redemption, there are certain things that take place when we see the point where the redemption is completed, where the geula happens, and that's the war of Gog and Magog. That's that final war which occurs in the end of days, at the end of times. Moshiach ben Dovid himself comes, and there are others who are melavehim, who accompany him. Moshiach ben Yosef is involved in that, and this offspring, Sherya, this offspring from the tribe of Dan, he's also involved. What Chazal are telling us is that there's a certain rubric, there's a certain way that things go. And you see these things, whenever you see these things happening, you can know that this is a point along the way of redemption. This is not, it seems like it's the opposite of redemption. It seems like it's the death of Yakov Avinu, the death of Jacob, but it's also a point along the way of redemption. And not just a point along the way like this is something that we have to get past, but it's actually something that we need. We need to go down in order to go up. We need to have the exile in order to have the redemption. We need to have those experiences in order to experience the elation. We need to have that negativity. The brothers of Yosef needed to go through what they went through in order to have that ultimate reconciliation with Yosef. The Jewish people need to go down to Egypt in order to come out of Egypt, in order to be redeemed, and in order to receive the land of Israel. And that's true on a national level, and it's true on a personal level. And while we spoke last week about the fact that when a person is connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when a person is connected to God completely, so the waves, so to speak, that a person endures are not as wide. They're not as high, they're not as low. But nevertheless, a person still has to go through process. A person still has to go, like Chazal say, when it comes to Yosef, if he wouldn't have depended upon the Saramashkim, the cupbearer, to help him, the wave would have been a lesser wave. It wouldn't have been 12 years in jail. It would have been only 10 years in jail. He still would have had to go through a wave, even if he had completely trusted in God. But still, there are different levels and different ways that we affect how things go and how things play out in our lives. But the idea here is that we do have to have that down, so to speak, the bottom of the wave in order to experience the crest, to experience the top of the wave. But the beautiful idea that Chazal are teaching us in the Midrash and in the Gemara and Sota is that you can see, if you look carefully, you can see characteristics of redemption even in the places where it seems that it's the opposite of redemption. Because those places really, and Hashem shows it to us, Hashem gives us these characteristics of redemption so we can see them even at the places where it seems like it's the opposite of redemption, so that we can gird ourselves, so that we can strengthen ourselves with the knowledge that this is a point along the way. And that's something that Yosef was able to do, that was his ability to do, and that's something that Chazal give us the opportunity to do as well in learning these types of ideas and learning these types of Midrashim and learning these types of Gemaras. So I want to bless you, and please bless me back. Hashem should help us, that we should be able to recognize when Hashem is showing us along the way, even in the challenges, Hashem shows us something that helps us see that this is a point along the way to our personal redemption. And Hashem should help us to also be able to see that in regards to our national redemption. Hashem should help us see that the challenges that we face nationally, whether it's the land of Israel, whether it's the people of Israel, whether it's in Israel or whether it's outside of Israel, all of these challenges, Hashem should help us see that they are just a station, and sometimes necessary, difficult, challenging, but just a station along the way to our ultimate redemption. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.